So just as I would trace the genealogy of classicism and what we call classicism in the United States, I would trace classical reception to such works as Charles Martindale's 1993 works. I believe it takes hold much more fully in the United Kingdom and across the pond rather than in the United States. In the classical reception framework, the author or artist, to a greater or lesser degree consciously, brings the classical text, idea, or myth to bear in modern or contemporary contexts. The reception model has always had within it the possibility of breaks and ruptures in the movement from classical to modern. In other words, classical reception studies has been much more capacious, much more conscious in its interest in literary and cultural theory. Its affiliations with post-colonial studies, for example, are strong. But I think, again, if I'm rejecting classicism, I also think that there's something missing in what we do in reception. And that's where I'd like to go next. And the traces are there, but I'd like to deepen it a little bit. Reception has not been sufficiently attentive to the bodily trauma of the receiver, the reader. Works like Parker and Matthews' 2011 Tradition, Translation, and Trauma demonstrate the sophistication of reception studies, although the volume is not particularly interested in the trauma of reception, the breaks or tears that the reader, viewer, or person who walks into a building might experience. Certainly there is some there, but what I'd like to do is deepen that a little bit, starting at this point in the paper. So the volume does point us in the direction of trauma and collective memory. In order to get at the trauma to which I'm referring, we need to return to the statues and their relationship to collective memory. Texts, ideas, artifacts, buildings are classical, whether they're classical, whether they're not, they're part of social or collective memory. And the idea of social or collective memory is useful because it helps to illustrate aspects of individual experience that are in fact part of group dynamics. Every individual is tied to an event held in common within some community. And we could stop at collective memory and we can take the work of, for example, Maurice Halbach's, who's one of the early proponents, thinkers of collective memory. But I kind of like the article Edward S. Casey, which I'll show you in a moment, and the subdivision of how we might think about collective memory. And I want to show you this just to enrich what we might be thinking about when we talk about collective memory. He says, for example, and I'll show you the first one, that social memory is the memory held in common by those who are affiliated either by kinship ties, by geographical proximity in neighborhoods, cities, and other regions, or by engagement in a common project. For Casey, collective memory, on the other hand, is distinct from social memory in that the form of memory can happen outside of kin groups. So I'm not related to you, but we might have the same memories, around the same events. A third example, he says, is public memory, which talks about such things as, and here it is in front of you, vigils, commemorations, monuments in parks and public spaces, and so on. These subtle distinctions, as I pointed out, are useful and important generally. We don't necessarily need them today, but they contribute to an understanding of how a particular individual might experience a text, a statue, a building, and so on. Memory is held in common, whether social, collective, or public, and it's different from the historical periodization of the past, such as distinctions between the classical and the modern, to the extent that this periodization, as Blythe puts it, as David Blythe puts it, quote, asserts the authority of academic training and canons of evidence, unquote. The distinction between history and memory, by the way, one made throughout Marantonio's book, which I cited earlier, Confederate Exceptionalism. This distinction is important when we come to public conversations about Confederate monuments and building names in Richmond, Virginia, and across the country. The issue of social, collective, or public memory was precisely what the students at Richmond viscerally, intellectually, intelligently, and in every other possible way understood. So on to trauma and memory. If processes of social and public memory are as much individual as they are collective, then public events can cause ruptures and tears or traumas for the individual. The individual might experience what is intended as a public or secular event or narrative, history, or even the classical, as trauma. Such was the rupture of the transatlantic slave trade, which caused a rip of individuals from their social tissue. This is the language that David Blight uses in a 2002 keynote at Yale University. Rip from the social tissue. Examples from Black subjectivity abound. As a social being, Frederick Douglass was born, that is, he became alive, he says, as a self, even though he was already nominally alive, when as a boy he saw the beating of his Aunt Hester. The reproduction or repression of a disturbing event, like the one Douglass describes, points to the developmental trauma that certain experiences cause. And I am interested here in trauma not as a psychological deficit, but certainly as impacting ways of being in the world. So people will often talk about this as disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, developmental trauma disorder. And in fact, the author I will cite momentarily wants to move away from this notion of deficit and just talk about the trauma. As Fred Moten sees it in Douglass's case, quote, Douglass discovers a hermeneutic that is simultaneously broken and expanded, unquote, because of the tear, the rupture, or what Moten calls the break, the cut that he endures. Including the classics in conversations about collective memory is not to give priority to certain pasts, say the Greek past or the Roman past. Rather, this contextualization affords an understanding of how particular texts, images, and structures that surround modern and contemporary people can be part of a tear in history, a rip from our social fabric. More to the point, the relationship between the classical and the modern or contemporary as a phenomenon of social, collective, or public memory helps us to understand the uneasy relationship, what is more, the trauma of given encounters for particular people. The encounter with the classics might well be a matter of interpretation. And here I'm pointing to Shadi Bart's really good Washington Post article on just interpreting the classics. Why not just lean on interpretation? And what I want to offer in that response to Daniel Padilla Peralta's highlight feature in the New York Times is that it lacks a critique of power.